Greetings and welcome to my video series How Not to Do Business. This is part 2 of the Law of Supply and Demand. My name is Paul B. and I am the Homeless Consultant. Thank you so much for returning for this video. In part 1 of the Law of Supply and Demand, I went through the theory, or at least my theory, of how the economic law of supply and demand works, and I tried to emphasize that unfortunately, in the United States today, in large part due to our public education system, people are a little bit confused about how the law of supply and demand works. And specifically, they have a more sociological view of supply and demand. But I will leave that for you to watch part 1 of this instead of rehashing it. In part 2 here, what I want to do is take that theory that I explained and explored in part 1, and I want to apply it specifically to the truck wash, which is the small business that I'm using as a model for how not to do business. I may have to chug a lot of water today. I don't know if you can see behind me or not. The snow has begun. It is getting very cold. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving, and I just checked my bank account this morning. I have $19 left, and I have no income. So I do have a gas card that will supply me with gas for hopefully as much as another week. I don't know if it'll go that long, but in terms of food and other things, I'm not sure. So if the quality of these videos is not too good coming up, it's probably because I'm trying to get them done while I have the opportunity to do anything at all. This one I'm really looking forward to, though, because it's the first time really I'm going to be able to bring together all the things I talked about in the introduction and all the things I talked about in part 1 of Supply and Demand, the theory. And I think here you're going to see how when you apply these to a real-world business like the truck wash and real-world managers, owners like Mr. H, you're going to see how not to do business. And from that you can gather how to do business. So let's just jump right in and get to it. I'm just going to put the chart up that I came up with that illustrates the law of supply and demand, and just without going over it again, I just want to recap that the white matrix in the lower right hand corner is basically tells you what happens to price as supply and demand change relative to each other. The green area tells what you as a manager or an executive can do to affect supply and demand in your business, in your industry. And then the red area are external influences. These are things that kind of come at you, and you really don't have any control over them for the most part. You might be able to lobby the government to change things, but that's a very slow process. But for the most part, you're reacting in the red areas to something external. In the green areas, you're being proactive. You're managing. And then those 3 statements at the top of the chart really bring the whole thing home. And I'll just read those again. A competent business manages these factors, all the things you see in green and red, manages these factors to the best of its ability. And that's what a company does, a competent business. That's what management is supposed to do. Then to manage means to respond to changes in a system toward the fulfillment of clearly defined and agreed upon goals. And again, the agreed upon goals are usually going to be set at the higher levels of management, regardless of the size of your company. And again, depending on the size, middle management, lower management is going to set and meet tactical goals to reach these strategic goals. And then, of course, a stagnant, unchanging, non-moving system would require no management. And what that's getting at is when you evaluate a company or a business, do they have too much management or not enough management? And the management that is present, what are they doing? Are they servicing the company by managing what you see in this chart? Because that's what they're for. Or are they looking out after number one? Are they looking out after their own careers? Are they trying to rise through the ladder, and no matter what happens to the rest of the company? Are they really team players, or are they people who just put signs on the wall that talk about teamwork? So that's what I'm getting at with this chart here. And with that in mind, we're going to look now at the truck wash specifically. Again, if you haven't watched the introduction, you need to watch it, please, because I'm just going to refer, for the most part, to things that I explained in detail in the introduction here. So, in this case, our business is, in fact, a truck wash. And the question is, what is our supply? What is it that we're supplying? And essentially, I have 4 things I put down here. First of all, our supply includes our ability and our capacity to provide the services that we provide, which are washing trucks and doing trailer washouts for the most part. Also, our willingness to provide these services, and that's different than our ability and capacity. We could have everything up and running, ready to go. You could have well-trained staff, gung-ho to get out and wash, but is something interfering with the willingness of the business to do what it could physically do? Thirdly, there's, of course, competition. Now, of course, we're not supplying competition, but the existence of competition and what that competition is affects what our supply is, because we're providing a service in this case. That's why. And then the existence, feasibility of other alternatives for our customers, which in this case would be things like self-washes. Is there a self-wash where a truck that large can pull in and pull out a hose and start washing it themselves? Do they have access to some other garden hose somewhere that could reach around an 18-wheeler? Or is it feasible for them to just leave it dirty? So all of those things are really kind of define what our supply is. Now, I'm going to come back and look at these later in terms of how we actually fulfilled these, but let's move on to demands. First, I'm going to list 2 primary demands, which is really what I just mentioned a moment ago. First of all, quality truck washes. So the exterior of trucks, whether it's a pickup truck dually or it's a big 18-wheeler show truck, either way, they want the exterior washed and they want a quality job done. And then number 2, the trailers, those big 53-foot boxes, what you normally consider to be a big rig going down the road. You have to wash out those trailers between loads, or between many of the loads, so that they have a clean trailer, and the distribution center will allow them to pick up a load, which is how they make money. So they need washouts that will not be rejected by whoever they're picking up from, wherever they're getting their freight from. But there's also some secondary demands that I experienced working at this truck wash. Probably the most common after those 2 was metal brightener. Again, that's just something we put on rims, shiny rims, the wheels, the battery boxes, the bulkheads in the back, the metal fuel tanks, and it kind of just brought out the metal, more like a fluoride treatment than a magic potion. It didn't just make it shine as if you had polished it, but it kind of helped. Also, engine washes. Sometimes they would just want their engine washed, or they would usually get it in addition to other washes. But sometimes they had a leak, or they were about to go get a repair, so they wanted their engine washed. Now, this next one is one I have never even mentioned before, so it's the first time I'm saying it. I call it purchasing receipts. And what that is some drivers would come in and they weren't so concerned with getting the wash done as they were with getting a receipt for the wash. And the reason is because sometimes when they go to pick up a load, they just have to show a receipt showing that it was done. Now, of course, for me, and I would hope for anyone, this is unethical, but it is a demand that not a huge percentage at all of drivers. It was pretty rare that it happened, but over time it happened many, many times. And it was usually the same handful of drivers, but it was a demand, and I want to talk about it. Another secondary demand was to wash a specific area of the vehicle. So they might have an oil leak or a fuel leak or a hydraulic leak, or again, maybe they're going to get something repaired, something around their 5th wheel back there, which is where the trailer connects. And so they wanted to get a specific area cleaned up for some specific reason. Another thing they asked for, especially after I started advertising for it, was metal polishing. And unlike the metal brightener, which is again kind of like a fluoride treatment, this is like getting false teeth, nice shiny white teeth. I mean, you go in there with the machine and zzz, and you really shines. So that was another demand that they had. Now I put down 2 more: interior cab cleaning. So just like in here, the cabin of my car is really filthy because I live in it. Same with them. So they might want vacuuming. They want to get their windows washed on the inside. All the dirt taken out. And it was pretty rare that we had that request, to be honest. And in fact, that's what got me started on this. If you look at the introduction, that's the original thing I thought of doing for truck drivers at this truck stop. That's what got me to visit the truck wash in the first place. And lastly, I put in there repairs, such as repairing tires or diesel engine repairs, things of that nature. Now, of course, we don't provide that service at a truck wash, but if they don't know that when they walk in, they have that. They ask about it, and in that sense, it is a demand. So the question is, how did we deal with it? Okay, so that is primary and secondary demands from the customers. Now there's also a category that I'm calling pricing demands. So this is demands in terms of pricing, obviously, that the customers had at the truck wash. And I'm estimating, I'm kind of off the top of my head, but again, I was there 7.5 months, 6 days a week. I have a really good feel for what was going on. I would estimate 95% of the customers who came in there, above all else in terms of pricing, they were seeking a good value. Now, of course, value concerns a balance between the quality and the price. And different people have a different view of that. They might be willing to pay a little more for better quality. They might expect a certain level of quality at a lower price. But somewhere in there is what people consider value. And of course, because everyone sees that a bit differently, it's a little difficult to deal with. But I want to distinguish it from, say, an absolutely positively extraordinary wash without a grain of sand left on the truck, and I want it at such and such a price. We weren't getting a demand for that kind of thing. We had a demand almost always for a good value. But inherent in that was a quality wash. Maybe not extraordinary, but not mediocre. A quality wash. I also put in there, though, about 5%, and that might even be a bit high, but probably not. About 5% of the people the drivers were in fact looking for a low price. To such an extent that they might be willing to shop around. And again, around us, you're going to see the competition was very, very far away. So shopping around wasn't super feasible, and you have to really be concerned about price if you're going to try to shop around in our case. So, but the point is, about 5% of these people were really concerned with getting the lowest price they could. And it was usually because you had independent drivers, and they just don't have a lot of money to spare. That was a lot of the reasons for it. And I added a third pricing demand. Again, this is another thing I've never mentioned in any of these videos yet. I better take another sip here. It's what I call washout prices over the phone. And what I mean by that is that daily, several times every single day, even on Saturdays, drivers would be on the road and they're looking to get a trailer washout. Remember, the trailer washouts, many of these drivers have to do it between every single load or between, very, very frequently. So we had drivers who came in almost every single day who were doing local runs. Now, if you're driving down the highway and you don't know where a truck wash is and you're trying to figure out where to get a wash out that you need so badly and you want to find out where you can get it the cheapest, you're going to call around while you're driving or have your dispatcher do it, and they're going to ask you, do you do trailer washouts? And we would say yes. And then they say, how much is the washout over the phone? And for reasons that I'll go over when I look at these in detail, I consider that a pricing demand because, again, many times each day, every single day, this happened often. I can't stress enough how often this happened. I can't estimate it either, but I can't stress enough how often it happened. They had a demand to know the price before they arrived at our business. Okay, and we'll see why that's important later. Now let's take a quick look at, and again, our goal here is to understand what our customers want. In this case, for a truck wash, what were the demand goals? And again, working 6 days a week for 7.5 months and running the place by myself quite often, I have a very good idea at our place of what these goals were. First of all, there was cleanliness for reputation's sake. And this was more with the independents who had trucks that they had custom painted, or they, they have to establish a good reputation for themselves. And just like anyone going to work trying to wear nice clothes and wash your hair and try to look good, it's the same thing with their truck. They're trying to present a good image of themselves to their customers so that they can make money. And we're supplying that cleanliness for them. We had a lot of construction trucks who would come in sometimes even twice a week. And again, these are expensive washes, up to $100. They would bring their whole fleet in. There's a couple that brought their whole fleet in every single week, and they would just be full of mud and dirt because they were out on construction sites, and we would clean them all up. And you know what? That makes them look really good in that environment when they're out in the pits. And the engineers, the people who are hiring them to come in, see that they take pride in their own equipment, and that's going to help them get better business and give them a better reputation. So that was a big deal in terms of the goal of these demands that they have for, exterior washes, engine washes, things like that. Also, this one is similar, but it is different. There was a demand goal of cleanliness for pride's sake. And in this case, it wasn't necessarily because this would aid their reputation in terms of them getting more business, that it would help them. It's just someone who takes pride in their vehicle that they own, their tool, and in some cases their home if they're sleeping in these trucks. So again, it came down to a lot of independent drivers, but also some of these corporate show trucks. And I guess in that sense, for reputation, they have to look clean as well, but they're trying to take pride in it. It's a lot like, me. I'm homeless and I live in a car, but I try. There's nowhere to maintain my hygiene, but I do my best to keep my hair washed and clean. I do my best to wear clothes that don't look too raggedy. I want to present an image of myself, and it isn't so much for reputation because the homeless label will always override that. But it's just I want to take pride in myself and present myself as well as I possibly can. And that's why I do it, and that's why these drivers would often do it. There's also to meet external requirements. That's one of the goals of why they would come in and use our services. For example, I mentioned before the distribution centers or where they're going to pick up their freight, they would have demands. They want to see a receipt. But of course, the receipt presumably means that the work was actually done, which we'll look at in a moment. But the egg farms in particular were getting to the point where they're starting to demand that drivers would wash the exterior, the tractor, and the trailer, and do a trailer washout of the 53-foot box. And they had to do it within 60 miles and on the same day that they pick up the eggs. And that was in a movement to prevent a lot of these epidemic diseases from spreading, from bacteria being brought onto the egg farms. So that was meant to look out for your safety as the consumer. But from a driver's perspective, that is an external requirement that they must meet. They can't pick up the eggs without that. And it was the same thing with a lot of these food distribution centers. They had to have a trailer washout that would meet the standards of that distribution center so they wouldn't be rejected. So another external requirement, Department of Transportation, DOT, they have their own, I guess you call it a police force out there, and they pull over trucks if they see something that looks like, a leak or some real filth on it or some other maintenance issue, and they'll issue them citations. And if Department of Transportation tells you your truck's too dirty or you have to clean up that diesel leak, even though you may have fixed the leak, all the diesel that's sprayed all over your truck, you have to clean that up. If DOT tells you to do that, you're going to do it. So that's an external requirement that's being met by our services. And lastly, I put in here, and I only saw this 3 or 4 times maybe, but it was consistent what I saw. These are people who are going to sell their trucks, and they're bringing their trucks in to get them washed to prepare them for selling them. And it's just like if you're going to sell your car, you're going to clean it out and vacuum and wash the windows and go get it washed because you want to present it well and you want to get the best price that you can for it, and cleaning it up is the easiest way to get there. So I saw that in 3 or 4 instances, and when we look at this in detail, you'll see why I even brought it up. It's because what happened in each of those cases was exactly the same, and it's relevant to the discussion here. Alright, so what I've just done is I have listed out the basics of what supply and demand are for a truck wash. And I don't have my drumsticks out, but in the part 1, when I talked about theory, I was talking about selling a product, those drumsticks. Here, though, at the truck wash, we're selling services. And there's some differences because of that, as you can see. So, but again, if you look at the chart, the supply and demand chart, and you look at the green and the red areas where it talks about what can you do to affect supply and demand. And of course, as supply and demand change, the pricing can change or stay the same. But the point of all this is to manage all of that so that you have the maximum revenues and the best margins and ultimately the best profit. That's the goal. So starting with supply and demand, let's look at what I just listed out in terms of what I described as how this truck wash operated in the introduction. And let's see how Mr. H did with this. Alright, so the first part of our supply is our ability and or capacity to provide these services at all. How did we do? Well, we had unilateral shutdowns. We had, for example, the 5-week shutdown for painting that the Redneck Mafia imposed upon all of us without any advanced warning. It was supposed to be 2 weeks, and then one day at a time it was pushed out to 5 weeks. We didn't really have an ability or a capacity to provide our service there, did we? There's also Mr. H shutting down the business frequently so that he could just work on the machine. And by the way, when I say work on the machine, I don't mean to make it sound like he's making it function. He's trying to figure out how it works. That's why he accomplished nothing in all the months he was working on it. He wasn't doing anything in particular. He was just, because there's no blueprints or anything, there's so many wires up there, he was just trying to figure out how the thing worked so that he could then make it do something. So all of this effort he put into that, again, accomplished nothing, and usually it would break something so that things didn't work as well as they did before. He would shut down the wash bay to work on that machine. Even if there's trucks waiting, even if it's business hours, that affected it annihilated our ability, our capacity to provide these services. And it happened frequently, and it happened without any advance warning. And that affects the customers who come there to get a wash. Also, frequently, regularly, as we went through supplies, we would just run out of them. There was no monitoring of supplies in any meaningful way, or maybe even in any way at all. Basically, we would run out of it, someone would tell Mr. H, and then maybe a few days later, we would get resupplied. In the meantime, we can't provide the service. If we run out of soap, we could, this gets into ethics, but Mr. H would still provide the service, he would just provide it without soap, which means a really, really, really bad wash, which again, to me, comes under ethics. But we weren't able or have the capacity to provide the quality wash when we run out of supplies, which was basically all the time. And then lastly, frequent maintenance problems. You can hear from the introduction, nothing worked in this place and nothing got a permanent fix to speak of. There was always something going wrong with hoses, water supplies, soaps. Just on any given day you go in there and you can just spin the roulette wheel to see what it is that's not going to work today. That affected our ability to provide these services, both in the wash and the washout bay. Alright? Then the next category is our willingness to provide these services. That's a part of our supply. Well, how do we do there? Well, I told you, Jethro in particular liked to shut down the business whenever he could. If he could shut down a half hour or an hour early, he would just put a sign up saying closed for maintenance, and then he would go play softball. He would turn away trucks all the time. He just didn't like the cut of a driver's jib, so he'd find some excuse to get rid of them, or he'd just tell them off, basically. And again, I estimated Jethro cost on throughout the entire year annually that he was costing about $30,000 in business that he's just sending away or otherwise preventing from coming in and having our services when we did have the ability and the capacity to do it. And Mr. H didn't care. We also turned away tankers and car carriers. Okay, now that affects our willingness. However, in this particular case, it's not so bad. Handling tankers is a very different situation than what we did. Tankers carry some pretty nasty chemicals sometimes, and they have different standards and different needs. So the only tankers we took care of was one company, and the deal was the drivers actually cleaned their own tankers. We just provided the facilities. So they would drive in and all by themselves get out the hose, climb up there, and clean out their tankers. And it was just that one company. As it turns out, our nearest competitor specialized in tankers, so we complemented each other well in this area. But that is a factor. If you're going to list out our willingness to provide these services, we did not have a willingness to service tankers. Although in this case it was for good reason. Also car carriers, and the main reason is because car carriers are so, when you look at how large those things really are, they could damage, because our wash bay had those rails in it, which were very narrow. Some of the trucks, both wheels would hit the sides of this rail. There wasn't any real clearance in there, and the car carriers were just too big. They damaged that. So we had to turn away car carriers. But frankly, it was pretty rare we had a car carrier come in anyway. So in terms of willingness, there were those two types of vehicles that we would turn away, but there was pretty good reasons for it, and frankly, there was very little demand. So it didn't really affect us one way or the other. However, in terms of willingness, again, Mr. H frequently, by his own will and volition, would shut down the business or shut down the wash bay to work on that machine. Well, that's a willingness issue. He did not have to do it there. He could have done it before hours. He could have done it off after hours. He could have done it on Sundays. But instead, he might say he's going to come in at 7 in the morning, and he wouldn't show up until 8:30. And he would shut down the bay to start working on it. And when we open at 9, he's still working on it. And the wash bay could stay closed till 10, 11, 12, whenever he's done. All that without advance warning and with trucks waiting and trucks coming up to get washes, and we have to send them away. That's our willingness. That's not our ability and our capacity. And frankly, it's Mr. H's willingness, because it wasn't me and Jethro. Well, Jethro probably didn't mind, but it certainly wasn't me. I was doing everything I could to make sure that we were open for business when we're open for business. I mean, it seems kind of like a no-brainer, doesn't it? But that's not the way Mr. H ran this place. And then lastly on this category I put down, again, Mr. H gave a lot of credibility to Jethro in terms of forecasting, because Jethro had 6 years experience washing trucks. And I only had, I don't know, a couple decades experience in revenue management. So what do I know? So Jethro would always want to shut down on holidays, and not just on the holiday, but on the whole weekend surrounding it. So 3 or 4 days for a one-day holiday like Labor Day. And it cost us a tremendous amount of money, but it affected our willingness, because we decided whether or not to be open on those days. And ultimately it was Mr. H who decided. But he did it based on what Jethro told him, and Jethro didn't want to work. Had he listened to me, I was always saying, no, of course we should be open. Of course we should be open, and here, let me show you why, because I had been doing revenue tracking and things like that that could forecast fairly accurately. I mean, accurately enough to get some sense of what was going on. So that's how our willingness went. It wasn't good. Not because of me. I'm the one who wanted to be open all the time. In terms of competition, now this truck wash benefited Greatly in this case, because we really didn't have any competition to speak of. Our nearest competitor was about 30 miles away, and again, they specialized in tankers. And from what I heard from other drivers, their quality wasn't very good either. So they weren't going to threaten us by doing better washes. Beyond that, the nearest one I think was 70 miles away, but the nearest real feasible, well-known one was 200 miles away. And when I say that this place could have been a gold mine, that's one of the things I'm talking about. When you have that little competition for these professional services, it's just inexcusable that we're turning away business left and right instead of doing business left and right. But in terms of competition, listed out as a factor in our supply, I have to admit we weren't hurt by that. But here's the amazing thing. Despite what I just told you about how we really had no competition to speak of, we still had customers who would deliberately go the extra miles to go to a competitor. Sometimes even that competitor who also didn't do a very good wash. And you know why? They would tell me why. They would say it's because I can't stand the way this place is operated. And specifically, a lot of them would say, I can't stand being around that owner. The guy drives me crazy, Mr. H. So we would even without competition, we were losing drivers to competition because we were so offensive that drivers didn't want anything to do with us. And that's how not to run a business. All right, let's look at existence, feasibility of other alternatives for drivers. Again, we lucked out in this case. As it happens, there really weren't any alternatives. There's nothing feasible about pulling out a garden hose somewhere to wash an 18-wheel truck. If you ever washed your car with just water and no soap, you'll see exactly what I mean. It blows off a light outer layer of dust, but the dirt itself just kind of gets swirled and moved around, and then when it dries, you see all that haze and film because it wasn't taken off. So without a self-wash that had proper soaps in the area, which I'm not aware of one being out there, and the drivers could never tell me that there was one near us, there really was no alternative. So once again, we benefited from the absence of feasible alternatives for drivers outside of competition. And yet, again, some drivers would just say, I'd rather keep my truck dirty until I get to another place. I'd rather keep my truck dirty than come into this place because you run it so poorly. So that's how we did in terms of supply. I hope you can see the problems already. Now about demands. All right, so we have the primary demands. The first one is a quality truck wash. And again, by quality, I don't mean extraordinary, but I mean something beyond mediocrity. Okay, if there's dirt on there, it should be taken off. It doesn't have to be polished and waxed and all that, but it should at least get the dirt and the grime off. That's what these people are paying, anywhere from $50 to maybe $125 for a wash for. Well, how did we do? Well, first of all, our washes were totally inconsistent. Absolutely inconsistent. One wash had nothing to do with another. We had no procedures, we had no training, and in the case of personnel, again, I did extraordinary washes pretty much every time. I mean, I certainly sought to every single time. Jethro had no interest in that. He had an interest in getting done as quick as he could so he could go back and stare at his phone some more. Mr. H demanded mediocrity. Remember, he would jump down my throat if I went and did an extraordinary wash because to him it took too long. Which it didn't. It just took as long as it takes to do a good wash. It was Jethro who wasn't taking long enough because he just went out and then he went and sat in front of his phone. So everything about our washes throughout was inconsistent and mediocre, and Mr. H wanted mediocrity, even to the point where he would get on me because I was doing a good job, too good of a job. His goal for the machine that he was making was to do consistently mediocre washes. It was his goal. He didn't want it to do extraordinary washes. He wanted it to just do enough to where he wouldn't get, on the cost balance, in terms of how many complaints is he going to get. And if it's an automated system, he's not going to get many complaints because there's no employees there. He wanted a mediocre wash that trucks would drive into, they would leave, they would be very unhappy with what they got, but it's good enough to where they're like, I gotta get out and make money. I can't waste my time fighting this. There's not even anybody at this automated wash. That's what Mr. H wanted. All right, so were we providing quality truck washes that were being demanded? Absolutely not. Not even close. Not even close. We also used soaps that burned metal. That's all they did. Look up the story in the intro about that soap I call BK. That's all it did. It burned metal. That, near as I could tell, that was the purpose of the soap, was to burn metal. I don't know what the other purpose was. And Mr. H had no problem with using that as a direct replacement for soaps that did not burn metal. Obviously, the quality was not being met. The quality that was being demanded by the customers was not being met. That's why we had so many complaints. That's why our reputation was so bad. And one of the reasons that the work environment was simply awful. And for me, again, from an ethical perspective, I understand the driver's pain. And you're between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand I work there and I depend upon that job for my survival, and yet I'm absolutely disgusted with what we're doing. And even though in the background I'm trying to fix it, I'm trying to talk to Mr. H and Jethro to get better quality, nobody would have anything to do with it. So then the drivers would blow up at all of us, and I don't even blame them. And it's a terrible situation to be in, because I don't blame the drivers for even yelling at me. But the fact was, I was the one person there who was fighting really hard. Ultimately, I lost my job because of it. I was fighting to give them exactly what they were paying for, which was a quality wash. How about washouts that would not be rejected by distribution centers and such? Well, they were inconsistent. Can you believe that? Like everything else we did, they were totally inconsistent. Now, if Mr. H had his children out there doing a trailer washout, they could be really, really bad. But there were a couple other employees who came and went who also did really, really bad jobs. I did a very good job. Again, I went out to the distribution center and asked them, what do you want in a trailer washout so they won't be rejected? And I modified what I was doing to make sure I did all those things, like spraying all the seals and making sure the drainage was proper and things like that, and the doors. No one else was doing that. Mr. H, Jethro, they just washed the interior and that was that. But the main thing is they were inconsistent. Now, the thing is here, I never did hear of anyone being rejected because of the washouts. And I think a lot of that is because they were adequate enough. It's hard to say. I think they were adequate enough for the local distribution centers. Now, the people who are traveling cross-country or interstate, they might not have got, if they did get rejected because of something we did, it may have been so far down the line that we never heard about it. I don't know, but I will be honest and say I don't recall hearing of anyone specifically being rejected because of the job we did there. However, it doesn't mean I was proud of the job we did, because it was inconsistent, it was mediocre, especially when you get into things like sanitizer, deodorizer, the fiascos that went on with that. I felt like our place was just stealing from drivers, because it was just a fiasco of how we would mix the sanitizer, deodorizer. Nobody had the foggiest idea how that stuff worked or if it was functioning properly. Sometimes if they ran out of it, they would just throw in whatever chemical they could find laying around and call it a sanitizer and charge for it. So again, even though I can't say I saw any drivers being rejected specifically because of what we did, I have absolutely nothing to be proud of in terms of what we did with washouts, except for what I did, because I take pride in my work. And again, Mr. H there too would get on me about taking supposedly too long. You know, that was only with the really dirty trailers, because the simple ones, you know, it doesn't take long for anybody to wash out. Alright, in terms of secondary demands, the metal brightener, the little treatment that's kind of more like fluoride than a full polish. Well, can you believe it? It was inconsistent. Hard to believe. Every time we mixed that stuff, it was mixed differently, because it wasn't automated and there was no procedure for how to do it. No instructions. Take a little bit of, we would have the concentrate, we would take this 5-gallon jug of concentrate, pour it in a bottle, pour in some water, shake it up, and go spray it on. And then when you spray it on, you have to saturate the surface, and Jethro would just kind of, and it would stream down. I would get in there and try to saturate, especially with wheel rims, and I made sure I got underneath because, when the wheel rolls, you can see that part that's underneath. And then how long you leave it on there also has an effect on the quality of the brightener effect. Totally inconsistent for all those reasons. And again, I'm not tooting my own horn, this is just the way it was, and this is one of the points I'm making. The guy who lives in this car, the guy who now doesn't even have a job at all, is the only person who made every effort every time to make sure that we were doing a good job with the brightener. We were frequently out of stock. This is one of the things we would run out of all the time, and it was inexcusable because it was so much in demand. And we would run out, and then we would go 2, 3, 4 days without any brightener before we got more in. Could have been making money selling this the whole time, and meeting the demands of the customers who wanted it. You also had the issue of the fraud, like that time Jethro charged them in advance for the brightener, but then he found out we didn't have any, so he went out and he pretended to spray. He just sprayed an empty bottle out there and then rinsed off the wheels and pretended that, that's just outright fraud. Something I want absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with. But when I told Mr. H, he didn't care. He didn't want to hear it. In fact, when it came to fraud, ethics, anything like that, Mr. H was just, nope, 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 don't tell me and I won't know about it. There's also this issue of unrealized expectations when it came to metal brightener. What I just told you about metal brightener being like a fluoride treatment as opposed to a full polish, a lot of the drivers who would order this from us didn't even get that much information about what it was. In other words, based on the phrase metal brightener, they would be willing to pay an extra $10 to maybe $60, depending on how much surface area there was, for this metal brightener. And yet, other than myself, I'm not aware of, on occasion Jethro would do it, on occasion. I think it's usually when the driver specifically asked. But they were not in any habit at all of offering up front full disclosure to the drivers, here's what the metal brightener is, and here's what it does, here's what it doesn't do. So there were a lot of unrealized expectations from the drivers. Even if we did the brightener and even if it came out as good as we expected it to, that might have been a lot less than what the drivers expected it to do, because nobody told them when they paid for it that this is all it does. It is not a miracle worker. It's just a metal brightener. It's not a polisher. All right, in terms of engine washes, can you believe it? We were inconsistent. Yes, indeed. You open up the big hood to those trucks, and of course if there's two of us washing the truck, we would each spray one half of the engine, our side. If there's one of us, then we would run around and do the whole thing. And they were inconsistent because just like everything else, Jethro and the other people there would just do a quick spray in there, and that was that. I did a more thorough job. Now, I will say in this case, I think we came closer to doing an equivalent job because you kind of knew what to go for. If you saw grease or something in there, if you saw a lot of these dipsticks are kind of colored yellow or blue, but you see all the black grime, so you spray them and they turn blue, and you can tell it's been washed off. But for example, I would put soap on engines that had a lot of greasy grime, that kind of thing in there. Jethro and the other people would not do that. I would spray the inside of the hood, because this is one of the rare times those hoods open. So I'm not just going to spray the engine. I'm going to spray the inside of the hood, and that's not something that anyone else there would do. So it was inconsistent in that sense. And also I would try to hit the front of the radiator. It's usually kind of a tight squeeze to get it, and I didn't want to hit it directly because it might bend the metal fins, but I would try to blow out the radiator to some degree, because if you get some crud out of there, it can help them with their temperature control and even their gas mileage. And that was just a courtesy, that I just wanted to do for them. So they were inconsistent engine washes, but again, when you get into the engine, it's a small area, even though there's a lot of stuff in there. And I'll say another thing, our wash bay had terrible lighting, just simply awful lighting. You really could not see what was in that engine. You're really spraying in there blind. And I think the reason I did a better job on my side is because I just visually broke it up into little, not quadrants, but like, 10 different areas, and I would make sure I did each of those 10 areas as well as I could, and in theory that should clean the whole engine, whereas the other guys just went in and sprayed and they're gone. How about this purchasing receipts thing? Well, again, this is where drivers come in and they say, hey, tell you what, I'll pay you for a wash. You give me a receipt and you don't have to do the wash. So let's say they're going to one of those egg farms and they just want to prove, remember, they have to have a receipt showing that they got the wash and the trailer washout done within 60 miles and on the same day, or else they can't pick up their eggs. But what if a driver's running really late? They might come in there and say, I don't have time. This whole wash thing can take an hour and a quarter for you to do all this. I don't have that much time. Can I just buy the receipt and go? Now, the people here would say, sure, go for it. And that disgusted me. Remember, with the egg farms in particular, the reason for that is to prevent the spread of things, I don't know exactly what, but avian flu and things like that. They're trying to prevent the spread of epidemics. It's totally unethical for us to do that. So there's a case of a customer demand that we should not be meeting for ethical reasons. And instead, of course, like I said, this truck wash did everything wrong. They would meet that demand. And Jethro loved it because it meant there was money on the books and yet he didn't have to work. That's another hour and a quarter he could stare at his phone. And this opened us up to potential legal liability, which Mr. H had no concept of. From what I could tell, Jethro certainly not. Absolutely nothing. Jethro, this was a whole other universe to him, the idea of legal liability. So again, a case of where there was a customer demand that we should have said no to, but we didn't. So we did the wrong thing again. And it just disgusted me. Again, if I could have left there months and months ago, I would have, because of things like that. How about washing specific area? Again, if they have a fuel leak or a hydraulic leak or they're going to get a repair, they just want a specific area washed. Well, you can kind of tell from the other stuff I've talked about what's going on. It's inconsistent. We also had inadequate chemicals. We had no training. Again, like I said, with the sanitizer on trailer washouts, if they ran out of sanitizer, they'd often just take whatever chemical they had laying around, throw it in the truck and call it a sanitizer, because from their perspective, well, it smells, so it's a deodorizer, because we call it sanitizer / deodorizer. It has an odor, so it's a deodorizer. It may not be a good odor. That's craziness. That's so irresponsible. I cringe even talking about it, but that's what they did there. When it came to washing specific areas, we had the same issue. We did not have chemicals that were specific for getting oil off, or getting diesel fuel off, or getting asphalt off, or hydraulic fluid. We just had our soaps, and we'd spray it on there, and we'd spray it with a power washer and see what we got. And again, with the bad lighting in there, we often didn't really know how good of a job we did till the driver pulled out into the sun. So they were very inconsistent. We had no real means to deal with specific types of stains and spills, no training whatsoever, and perhaps most importantly, again, other than myself, there wasn't a lot of concern for it. And I'm going to be honest with you here. I'm not going to say nobody cared. I don't think Mr. H cared, but Jethro, and especially this guy who was there in the summer briefly, on many occasions when they had something like this, they actually did take an interest in it. And I think it was because it was such a limited task. It was something they could do very quickly, 5 minutes or so. This is one of the areas where they were better at it than others. I'll just leave it at that, but it still had the inconsistency. When it came to metal polishing, recall from the introduction that metal polishing is something that Jethro and this guy in the summer came up with. Mr. H, without thinking about it, without budgeting for it, without any planning whatsoever, went out and bought all this equipment and supplies, and they started polishing. I went out and did all this marketing and to advertise for it. We got a lot of feedback from drivers asking about metal polishing. But after they did 2 or 3 trucks, they just stopped doing it at all. They stopped even returning people's calls or answering the messages that I took for them and about polishing. It was just a total fiasco. So it was a demand that we had, and the demand went up specifically because of the advertising I did when we started offering it, and yet they stopped doing it. And then they didn't even really want to talk to drivers about it. I never understood why they even stopped doing it, except that they did such a bad job. They actually mangled one of the trucks out of the 2 or 3 that they polished. So, in other words, they didn't know what they were doing. There was no training, no real testing. They tested on a couple wheels, individual wheels. There was no research. They just went out and did it. They just, like so many things they did there. So, in terms of meeting that demand, we failed about as miserably as you possibly could. And yet, again, I didn't do any polishing, I wasn't trained to, I didn't know how to, I wasn't in on that. But if you're going to look for someone who did something right there, I did the advertising. I mean, I thought we were going to do it at the time. I wouldn't advertise it if I knew they weren't going to provide the service. But I did advertise it, and I would take messages, and I would give those messages to Jethro or the other guy in the summer. But, you know, they usually wouldn't get back to the drivers. In terms of the demand for interior or cab cleaning, like in here, you know, like a cabin, we did not provide that service, and in fact, our shop vac, I don't know how far into it, midway to when I was there or a little bit later, the little shop vac we had stopped working, and it just got thrown in the trash and wasn't replaced. You know, and a shop vac costs $20, $30. So if they had broken glass down there near their pedals, we didn't have a way to just go vacuum it out. We didn't even have a dust buster. Now, granted, we didn't offer cab cleaning services, but it's kind of inexcusable that we didn't have anything to just... there's nothing we could do. Matter of fact, one time, I remember there was a couple, it was a married couple, and they came in, and they had some kind of crud on the inside of their windows, and they wanted them washed off, and of course we had nothing like that. I went out to my car and got this Miracle Glass stuff that works so well on my car, and I let them use my own bottle. And I think it was my own paper towel. I don't know whose paper towels, but I let them use my own bottle, and they used a lot of it. You know, and it cleaned it up pretty nicely. And of course, I didn't get reimbursed. I never got reimbursed. But the point is, we didn't provide that service officially, but it's rather inexcusable that we didn't even have a vacuum cleaner around, or at least a bottle of halfway decent window cleaner that could be used, or something. Also, we could not refer people to who would do this for them. And likewise, when it came to repairs, we were not a repair shop, so we were never going to repair tires or diesel engines or anything like that. But it was requested fairly often. You know, drivers, when something goes wrong, they're going to look for anything related to trucks and start asking questions. So even though we didn't provide any of this, the answer was usually, you know, like from Jethro. For Mr. H, it would be like, I don't know. There's probably got to be a place around here. Or maybe he's heard of, I think there's a repair shop down on such and such street, that kind of thing. And Jethro, you know, if he heard about it and he wasn't talking to the driver directly, he resorted to his, you know, well, sucks to be him attitude. But in this case, what did I do? I went out and I researched where the repair shops were and the mobile repairs, and I collated them into a file so that when drivers would ask me about it, I could give them a list of businesses that would do this and how to contact them. So again, the guy who lives in a car did that, but the owner of the business and the main employee, who was paid, you know, much more than I was, sucks to be them. Alright, so that kind of describes how the demands were met. And as you can see, for what it's worth, the demands were not met at all. Excuse me. Oh boy. I even have to conserve my water now because I have no money. I'm going to be drinking snow pretty soon. The point being that we didn't provide any service to speak of. We got away with it with the trailer washouts because I mean, it's not hard to do a trailer washout, to be honest. I mean, you've got to be really, really lazy not to at least get the main amount of dirt and grime out of those things, because you're just spraying it with water and you can visually see what's going on. With the trucks, they were such mediocre and inconsistent washes. We got a lot of complaints, a lot of bad reputations, a lot of bad reviews from drivers. Sometimes it would blow up into, you know, virtual fights. You remember that one time Jethro called the police on a customer because he was so upset, and then the police just looked and said, well, why don't you wash his truck? He probably wouldn't be so unhappy if you did a decent job. Well, I guess the point I want to make here is that all of that, when you look through all of this in terms of meeting their demands, it wasn't met, and it wasn't met because the owner wasn't making it sure that it was met, and in fact he institutionalized a what you might call an unwritten policy of doing a mediocre quality on everything. Meanwhile, the only person who was just constantly seeking to improve quality, constantly seeking to meet these demands better and better and better, as I put in my initiatives section of the introduction, was me, the guy who's living in a car, the guy who made the least amount of money there of anyone associated with the place. This is how not to do business. Let's look at the pricing demands. So the pricing demands, again, I estimate 95% or so, we're looking for a good value. And recall, though, value is a balance between quality and price. All right, so again, different people may have different idea of where a good value falls in there, but it concerns quality and price. Well, we've already looked at the quality. It's inconsistent, it's mediocre. In many cases, it's shameful, if not downright fraudulent. So we're blowing it there. How about the prices? Refer you to the introduction. The prices were inherited from the previous failed truck wash owners. Mr. H did no analysis, no adjustment of pricing. He did no revenue analysis to determine what prices should be. No competitive market analysis. I did, but he did none. So the prices were basically the same thing we had inherited from the previous ownership. And when Mr. H and his father would come in, they would often just quote prices off the top of their head. They didn't have the slightest idea what our pricing was. They didn't even know. So they could quote, $50, we'll do that for $50. And I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, this thing's $89. What's he doing? Something like that. So if our prices are incomprehensible and incoherent and inconsistent and they make no rational sense, and our quality is likewise mediocre and inconsistent, and yet quality and price are the two things that go into a value, then how can we provide a good value, which is what 95% of the drivers were demanding in terms of pricing? To me, that is the definition of failure as a business, failure as a business operator. Somehow Mr. H didn't see it that way. Again, the only person who was fighting and clawing to meet that demand of a good value is the guy who now has no job, $19 as it's starting to snow, living in a car. Something's really wrong here. As for those drivers who wanted a low price, I would estimate about 5% of them. A lot of them they just couldn't afford it. I mean, trucking's not an easy industry. There's good and there's bad out there. But, if you're a corporate driver, it's like anything else. You've got an expense account, more or less. The company will pay for washes at a certain interval or under certain circumstances, and they'll reimburse the drivers, so they're going to go more for that quality, or the value. But if you have someone who it's their own truck and they're all on their own and they don't have a corporation behind them, they're independent drivers, some of them were living on the edge so much they really wanted to keep their truck clean. It meant a lot to them personally and in terms of reputation. I mean, there were some really nice drivers. I really like these people. And I understand why they were seeking such a low price. Okay, now on the other hand, there were a couple groups in particular. I won't tell you who they were, but they were familiar groups of drivers. For instance, one of them seemed to emanate from Chicago quite a bit. Another one emanated from downtown Minneapolis, where I think they had a slaughterhouse in somebody's basement. These people were just plain cheap. Just plain cheap. And to kind of let you know where I'm going with this, if you go to some other countries, they have more of a barter system. And they really haggle and they get yelling and screaming at each other until they get the price they want. It was that kind of thing. Not what you would normally find in the professional world, but there were drivers from certain areas of the world who would demand a low price, frankly, no matter what. And in some cases, yes, they would demand a low price and the best quality wash you could ever imagine. And they were just totally unreasonable. That's kind of an anomaly here, but I'll just leave it at that. But let's see, did we meet it, first of all? Well, I just told you our prices made absolutely no sense anyway. So how can I say whether without a market, without analyzing your competition to find out if your prices are fair? How do you know if they're fair? Because these drivers all the time would come in and, we could quote, let's just pick a number. Let's say $49. I said it's $49. And some of these drivers would say, what are you talking about? I was just in, Arkansas, and Blue Beacon did it for $25. And you get that all the time. I was in California, they did it for $4. And most of the time they're lying through their teeth, But, I mean, how are we supposed to verify that? But the thing is, they might have been right. How are we going to know? Mr. H never did any competitive analysis. He just took the prices he inherited and left it at that. So, in terms of meeting even those people's needs, we really couldn't. And what really bothered me was like with the independent drivers who were very loyal to us, even though they really despised Mr. H. I mean, they really did not like Mr. H at all. It took, the only reason they came in, I think, is because it was closer to where they were, and they got along well with both myself and Jethro. I felt really bad for them that we could not offer them some kind of volume discount, because these were independents. That's their truck, their business. They have families to feed, and those are the ones who came in every single week. And again, more than half the time on average over the course of the time I was there, we had no trucks at that place at all. No business. I think we should have offered them a discount to keep their loyalty and to earn their loyalty instead of charging them full price. But anyways, how about washout prices over the phone? Okay, so let's get into this one. These drivers would call up and say, we would say, truck wash? Yeah, do you wash trucks? And we'd be, just quietly like, are you kidding me? Yes, we do. We wash trucks here at the truck wash. Do you do trailer washouts? Yes, we do. How much is it? Okay, and we get this frequently all day long. Now, here's the thing. Our policy, which was set by Jethro, who inherited this from the previous failed truck wash owners, and Mr. H just went along with it. Our policy, according to Jethro, was to never give a price over the phone for a washout. The reason is because it really did, in a way, depend on how dirty the truck was, so we kind of needed to see it. The problem is that most of the washouts we did were for trailers that were pretty darn clean. Let me put it this way. Our pricing structure was basically this. For the first 15 minutes, there was a set price, and then anything beyond those 15 minutes, it was $2 per minute extra. And if there was a lot of junk in there, like a lot of potatoes, or if there were pallets or large debris, we would have a disposal fee, which was arbitrary, to be honest. I mean, you just kind of had to look at it and gauge how much to charge them. So all of that could add up to a washout that's, $170 in the worst circumstance. Most washouts were, I think, $35. And that's if it takes less than 15 minutes and there's no surprises. Now, the thing is, we could have told each and every one of those drivers what I just told you over the phone. And guess what? Because the vast majority of them do have a fairly clean trailer, and therefore it would be $35 plus tax. There's no reason we couldn't have told them that, except Jethro told us not to tell them prices over the phone. Now, the reason they wanted to know this was, A, so they could shop around and know where to go, but also because a lot of them paid with these checks, ComCheck or EFS, Fleet One. And these checks, they had to get an approval for them in advance, and it took a lot of time. So if they knew the price coming in the door, they could already have that in the works when they arrive there. We do a quick washout, which might take 5 minutes. They hand us a check, and they can get on their way, and we can get the next truck in. So it was good for them and for us. In other words, it was really inexcusable that we did not, every single time they call, even though it's a hassle for us, every time we should have told them, here it is, $35 for the first 15 minutes, $2 per minute for every minute after that, and a possible disposal fee if you have anything of any size or substance, or a hazard in there, and then sanitizer, deodorizer is extra. We could have told the drivers that, and we would have met the demand of learning the washout prices over the phone. And yet we never did it because Jethro, again, he didn't like to work, and part of working is actually telling telling customers what they're asking for over the phone. And I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of glad that I didn't have to spend a lot of time answering that question on the phone over and over and over again. But I would have done it if I were allowed to, because it was good for the business. Work isn't always fun, right? So we absolutely failed on that account as well. And we probably lost business because of it. A lot of drivers would get very upset, and they would ask us, why can't you just tell me what the price is? And, Jethro, at some point, if they pushed him too hard on that, if they pushed him maybe 2 or 3 times on that, he would get really mad. He would insult them to such a degree that the driver probably wasn't even going to come in to our place ever. So, again, just totally inexcusable the way that pricing demand was handled by our truck wash. All right, now let's look at the demand goals. So again, the drivers, the construction trucks, and anyone who is trying to, look nice for their own, to build their own business, for their own professional careers and such, we weren't meeting that demand at all. We did mediocre, inconsistent washes. Some of them were terrible washes. They would come out of there with halvesies. I washed half the truck and it looks great, and then Jethro or the other guy would wash the other side of the truck and it looked terrible. So they come out with a truck that looks great on one side, and it's almost like those people wearing the suits that's black on one side and white on the other. It wasn't that extreme, but it's ridiculous. We're certainly not meeting the goal of their demand for a clean truck. And the same thing applies when it comes to for pride's sake. If it's for pride's sake, it's hard to take pride in a truck that hasn't been washed very well. In fact, it kind of makes you look foolish if people think about it, because you just spent $100 for an awful wash. If anything, that makes the driver look bad. And that's a shame, because frankly, it should be our truck wash that looks bad. And then with the polishing, when they had that metal polishing, which is a big deal in terms of someone taking pride in their vehicle. Again, but Jethro and the other guy, they only polished like 2 or 3 trucks, and one of them they absolutely mangled. This guy was getting polished so he could go take his truck to a truck show later that weekend. And Jethro messed it up so badly that the guy was too embarrassed. He didn't even go to the truck show at all. I'd say we didn't meet the goals of their demand for polishing. Okay, in terms of meeting external requirements. Again, I didn't really get any feedback. None of us really got feedback as such on what distribution centers were saying, but I did not see where where our drivers were being rejected. Now, again, I can't say that drivers who are traveling interstate wouldn't get rejected because they might not be picking up downline. And the truth is, a lot of these trailers, probably a large percentage, they were washing out the trailer, but they would then drop the trailer off and pick up another trailer. So the trailer itself becomes dissociated from that driver. And therefore, if that thing gets rejected, no one's going to go trace that through and come back to the truck wash. I don't think. So I have no reason to believe that drivers were regularly being rejected because of the job we did. But I think a lot of it has to do with just, again, it's so easy to wash out a trailer. It's almost... you really have to fight hard to not do at least an adequate job, although Mr. H's kids did that poor of a job. But I wasn't proud of them except for the ones that I did. And if it was for egg farms or something, from what I could tell, the egg farms were in fact looking for that receipt more than anything else. There were some distribution centers I heard that did the finger test, and so I don't really have an answer on that one. But the inconsistency, I have to believe we had some rejections in there. I'll be honest with you, what I honestly think it is, but I have no proof. I think when push comes to shove and a driver gets to a distribution center, I think they're not as stringent as they say they are. And I think they let a lot of things slide. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know. But, we did not send trailers out looking absolutely filthy or anything like that. So, in terms of trailer washouts. So I really don't know the answer there. I guess you could say in that sense we met the external requirements, and that's maybe a good thing. I don't feel like we did meet the external requirements, if only because I was the only person who washed seals and worried about the drainage and things like that, which were what some of these distribution centers looked at. By the same token, though, the Department of Transportation demands, these drivers who come in for DOT problems, they're traveling down the interstate, they get stopped by DOT, they get cited, they're going to go to the first place they can to get it fixed, and then they're back on the interstate. So we're probably never going to see these people again. So if we didn't do an adequate job, and I'll be honest, I don't know how DOT follows up on these, if they have some immediate reinspection or what, I don't know. But I never heard any feedback that said we had not met the demands of DOT. But again, they're traveling interstate almost by definition, so they might have got busted way down the line. I really don't know, and I wonder about that one because that often did have to do with things like fuel leaks. And we weren't good at that. We didn't have the proper chemicals to get rid of those. We were really at the mercy of whatever the power washer could do. And I know for a fact that I did a much more thorough job on those than, say, Jethro did. But I don't have I don't have any feedback on that, so I can't give you an answer. Now, in terms of prepping trucks for sales, again, we had 3 or 4 drivers come in. They're getting ready to sell their truck, so they want us to wash it. The thing that was consistent with them is that all of them, when we were done, turned the thing around in a circle and came back and said, you missed this spot, you missed that spot, look at this, you missed that. And frankly, a lot of drivers did this, but these guys, because they're selling it, they're really looking closely and carefully at the job we did. And it's notable that every single one of them not only had one issue, but they could just point out one after another, basically. They had issues. They had serious issues with the job that we did. And, of course, Mr. H would say, well, your clear coat's bad and the truck's old. And, there's all these excuses. But the fact is, we did a mediocre wash. That's the way it was. So you can tell that kind of looks at supply and demand as far as this truck wash works. Here's the question, though. If you look back at the chart, which is where you're dealing with management of supply, demand, the factors that affect supply and demand, toward the goal of meeting clearly defined, agreed upon goals, of which we had none at the truck wash because Mr. H did not manage anything. He had no goals. He had no training. His only goal was to do something with this machine that nobody could ever figure out. So, in terms of supply and demand, there was absolutely no management whatsoever toward anything in this chart. Nothing. And yet this chart is what is supposed to create the stable and prosperous system for everybody. In our case, for example, all the employees. Instead of employees having their pay cut in half for 5 weeks for painting unexpectedly. Instead of a homeless person working there for 7.5 months, 6 days a week, plus staying late, almost whenever asked to, almost always whenever asked to. After 7.5 months, still ended up living in a car with no money, no food on Thanksgiving as it's starting to snow. I mean, I am in mortal danger here. That's not the prosperous and stable system that should have been developed in this business. Mr. H failed in every conceivable way in terms, if you understand the law of supply and demand. And that's different than just pointing out, well, this place is the most dangerous workplace I've ever been in, and he didn't bill his customers, didn't send them out invoices, and he paid us late all the time. You can point those things out and it just sounds like, oh, this guy's a really bad manager. I'd hate to work for him. But when you look at it in terms of this chart for the law of supply and demand, you see the science of it. You see that scientifically, in terms of what is predictable, this business is doomed to failure. It can't succeed. It doesn't do anything that you're supposed to do when you manage a business in terms of revenue. And while he may have been willing to go his first year without turning a profit, there's going to come a point when he needs some money, and he's not going to get it. And they're going to go out of business. Or he's going to get propped up by something that it's going to be a ridiculous business. Maybe the redneck mafia will come to his rescue or something. But this isn't going to end well. And it probably won't end well for Jethro or any other employees he has. It's certainly not ending well for the drivers, the customers. Those people were professionals. They depended on us to do what we said we were going to do when we charged them that much money for these services, and we weren't doing it. And the drivers have, like it says in there, the drivers have goals and they have needs. There's a reason why they're getting these washes done. They're not like car washes where they just go, wow, my car is pretty dirty. I think I'll head on in and get it washed, for $7. These drivers are thinking, okay, this wash costs, after tax about $100. Do I need to get this done or not? And you can bet their answer is going to be yes before they come in for the most part. Now, lastly, I just kind of want to go through the green and red areas on that chart very briefly because I want to show you how it could have been at this truck wash. You've seen how it is. It's a miserable failure. It's just angered and upset, infuriated everyone associated with the place, the employees, the contractors. They despise Mr. H. The drivers who are in there regularly many of them won't even come in when Mr. H is there, the owner. The redneck mafia seem to have contempt for him, and there's just nothing going right at this truck wash, and it could have been a money-making bonanza. And doing it honestly, they could have been a money-making bonanza while really giving a great services to these drivers. And instead it did none of that. It's a total fiasco, all the way down to outright fraud. So now let's look at how it could have been if Mr. H had had the foggiest idea how to run a business, and if he had obeyed the law of supply and demand as it's described by my chart. Okay, so for example, in terms of things that you can alter demand with, in the chart, if you look in the green area above demand, you can engage in advertising, sales, and marketing. Alright, I won't go into detail here, we'll have a separate episode on that, but recall from the introduction, Mr. H specifically said, I do not want to market. I don't want to advertise. I don't want to market. I don't want people to know we're here until I'm done with this machine. Which was a fiasco. The machine was never going to be anything. And when I left, he had owned the place for 10 months. How can you run a business? How can you alter demand, which is part of managing your business? How can you do that if you refused to advertise and market, go out and get sales? If he had done that, we could have made a whole lot more money, had a much better customer base. Move existing products and services into new markets. That's not really feasible in our case. We have a building-based business. We're locked into our building, even though it's a service. Mr. H's dream, though, of doing whatever with this machine, getting it to do consistently mediocre washes, he wanted to get that done and then franchise it out, or I think more of the point, he wanted to just build a bunch of these himself and manage them himself. So he had some kind of bizarre dream there, somehow thinking that a mediocre wash is something that people were demanding. But until he did that, there was no way to expand this out into other markets. So that, in this case, there's nothing you could do right now. Introduce new products and services, however, yes, we could have done that. We could have done the polishing properly. I mean, look what happened. On that one, I did advertise. I just put signs up and I put it on the website and the phone message, and we got tremendous response from people. But we never did anything with it. What about when they were asking us to clean the interiors of the trucks? Why didn't we have a vacuum cleaner or something for getting the windows clean? Why didn't we just clean the interiors? We could have introduced new products and services. We could have had better soaps that were specific for diesel leaks and oil leaks and hydraulic leaks so that they get them off. Stuff to get rid of asphalt. That'd be awesome if we had that, but there wasn't even any desire to introduce new products like that. I mean, basically what we were dealing with was a complete and utter lack of management at this place. We had an owner, and boy, did he ever take over everything. He was the man. He said himself, I'm the man. I own this place. I call the shots. You know, everything except the buck stops with me, because he passed blame and accountability onto everyone but himself. But there was no management. This is how not to run a business. We could have done tremendous things with this truck wash. In terms of managing supply, what we could have done, well, how about business growth? I mean, Mr. H couldn't even get the basic fundamentals of this right. I never saw a business plan. I never saw or heard any evidence whatsoever that he had a business plan. As near as I can tell, he used to deliver soaps to this truck wash under the previous ownership. He got talking to the Redneck Mafia. The Redneck Mafia was upset that the previous owners were failing, and Mr. H just said, well, I can do a better job than that. And the Redneck Mafia, even though they're millionaires, apparently they're not the most brilliant operators in the world either, and they just did some handshake deal, and bam, Mr. H is the new owner of the place. I don't see any evidence of any business plan, of any plan of any kind. I mean, nobody planned anything. There's no project management. There's nothing. Absolutely nothing. Whatever is there is in the head of Mr. H and maybe somewhere in the minds of the Redneck Mafia. But it isn't on paper. So obviously, business growth wasn't going anywhere with this business. Look what could have happened if we'd had a business plan. If we'd had project management, if we'd had a schedule of here's what we're going to do with maintenance, permanent fixes for all these issues with water. We're going to get the customer service area looking nice and being presentable, and the coffee machine's actually going to work. And you just had a schedule like project management, and there was nothing like that. So there was no business growth, but there could have been in that sense. And along with that would have come tremendous revenue growth and increasing customers, because they were out there driving right. I mean, I could throw a rock at the highway. That's how close we were to the highway. Then drivers are driving by not knowing that we're there because we had no signs. And because we didn't mark it, Mr. H wouldn't even let us be in the directory for truck stops. In terms of quality, well, we could have implemented a quality control system. We could have implemented procedures for how to do these washes, how to mix the chemicals so that they're consistent, how to apply the chemicals like the metal brightener, the sanitizer. There's so much we could have done in terms of quality. We could have had someone who actually took responsibility for good quality doing evaluations and inspections. And we had nothing of the kind. But if we had done that, that would be managing this supply and demand, as the chart shows, and it would have improved our business dramatically. Now, in terms of research and development, again, I told in the introduction, the big mystery of trying to figure out how can Mr. H run this place this poorly. It doesn't make any rational sense. And eventually, I figured out what was going on. He saw this entire business, this operating, functioning business, as his own personal research and development site to work on that machine. That's why he did not mind coming in at any time he felt like it and just shutting down the business to work on this machine. And when I say work on it, he didn't do anything. He didn't fix anything. He was just trying to figure out how it worked, pulling wires out and tracing things and trying to draw his own blueprint of what it does or how to get it to do anything. This was his personal research and development site. But you know what? This was a functioning, operating business. He had employees whose their ability to feed their families, their ability to take care of themselves were dependent on this business. But he didn't treat it as a business. He treated it as his own personal R&D site. He had all these customers, all these truck drivers out there, the companies that they work for, the distribution centers they're associated with, and ultimately the customers they're delivering to. All of them are dependent in part on our ability to do a decent, what we're supposed to do with the truck wash. None of that's happening, because Mr. H did not see this as a functioning business. The narcissism here is beyond belief. It was just all about Mr. H, and if the employees suffer, and the customers suffer, and the contractors suffer, he didn't seem to care. Imagine how different it could have been. Imagine if our research and development had gone into other things, like how to do quality washes, how to automate certain aspects of things like mixing the chemicals so they were always the same. Imagine if our R&D went into that instead. Those would be things that improve the business, and they keep that improvement going forward. And instead, he treated the whole place as an R&D site, all for the machine. And of course his fascination with the security cameras, but mainly the machine, which had no function whatsoever. It certainly had no relation to revenue except an inverse relationship. We lost revenues whenever he worked on the machine. How about efficiency? Well, what if Mr. H had the slightest interest in monitoring supplies so that we never ran out, and therefore we didn't have to stop selling them and stop making money from them, or stop using inappropriate replacements for them because we ran out? That's one way we could have improved efficiency, and it would have improved our revenues. How about the cash controls? If he had improved, again, the cash drawer was never correct. No rhyme or reason to it. You could have $150 missing from the drawer with no explanation, and the owner of the business wasn't even upset about it. He didn't even care. I mean, I could tell him. I remember one time I was down $100 because Jethro had taken it out for his own personal use, and he left a sticky note in Mr. H's office saying, "Sorry, I had to borrow $100. No one told me." So I call up Mr. H, and I'm like, I'm $100 short in my drawer. I don't know what happened. Mr. H was just like, don't worry about it. Seriously? How not to run a business. What if he had improved the efficiency of the cash controls so that now we knew which employee it was who rang up a given receipt instead of having 4 or maybe even 5 people on that register at once, not knowing who ran up any given receipt? That would have been nice. What if we had had a coherent pricing strategy? If we'd made that more efficient? That would have benefited us and the customers greatly. And what if Mr. H stopped having his family members interfere with everything going on at that truck wash? No more kids running around treating dangerous, powerful equipment as skateboards. No more of Mr. H's father going up and just getting in the way of everything. No more of them quoting the wrong prices because they didn't feel like learning the prices. No more of them ringing things up incorrectly, or Mr. H getting in drivers' faces and talking their heads off to the point where they just wanted to leave. That would have been great. In terms of technology, well, what if Mr. H, instead of going on the cheap and buying things like all this equipment that kept breaking within a week or two of when he installed it, what if he had done some research and spent the money and bought really good equipment so that it didn't break, or at least nowhere near as frequently? Would have been more cost effective. We would not have these breakdowns that stop us from providing services. We would not be suffering the embarrassments and humiliations constantly that we suffered as a result of this rotten equipment. See the introduction called Humiliations for more on that. If he had developed that technology, it would have been great for everybody. What if he had stopped implementing, ideas and repairs with this duct tape technology and quick rigging? Again, look at the Humiliations. Look at the Humiliations intro. You'll see that example of where they rigged that stick to hold the no parking sign by putting it in the sewer with bungee cords. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's very embarrassing. What if he had done that right? What if he had done all of those kinds of things correctly? I mean, wow, it's just amazing how much money this place, how smoothly this truck wash could have ran. In terms of customer service, if Mr. H wasn't, if I've alluded to the fact that by all appearances, and I can't believe anything other than this, but by all appearances, Mr. H had a fundamental contempt for truck drivers as a class of people. And it's not to say there aren't individuals he enjoyed talking to. It was mainly topic driven. It wasn't the people he liked. It was a driver who started talking about whatever interested Mr. H, the Stalin or something. So if you start talking about something that Japanese history, if you find a driver who's on that topic, Mr. H has a great time chatting with them. But he wasn't interested in them as people at all. In fact, he seemed to show nothing but contempt for them. Well, what if that had not been the case? What if he had taken the kind of interest in these drivers that I had? I really wanted to get to know them. I wanted to learn from them. I wanted to learn their names. I wanted to know what was going on. If they kept coming back, I wanted to hopefully remember what they had told me last time and say, well, how's that project going you were going to start? Because I really care. I want to have a relationship with these people. Jethro wasn't like that. Jethro would talk about sports or TV shows with some drivers, but otherwise he didn't have anything in particular to say. Mr. H, his social skills were so bad, he just made everyone, well, not everyone, but he made most of the drivers just want to run and hide. And then you bring in his family, and oh boy, it gets even worse. In the customer service area, dangerous. Nothing out there but a coffee maker that didn't even work because the water supply didn't work properly in a truck wash, which is mainly water. You can kind of see there's a whole lot that could have been improved there. And then in terms of personnel, what could Mr. H have done personnel-wise that would have improved this business? Well, let's see. What if he did not torment his employees as he did with me and Jethro and, frankly, everyone there? If he didn't torment us. If he wasn't just abusive toward us, that would have helped. Not humiliate us, not shame us, not degrade us, not belittle us. It would have improved morale quite a bit. He terminated his only quality employee. He terminated me because I gave him my 2 weeks notice. Nothing makes sense at this place, believe me. But, for instance, the kid who, while he's on the clock, he would go back into a trailer and pull out an electronic cigarette and start puffing on that. And he left for lunch and didn't come back at all. And a couple days later, when he shows up again, his reasoning was just that he didn't feel like coming back that day. Mr. H didn't fire him. Jethro, who would come in late all the time without telling anybody, he'd oversleep, he'd leave early all the time to go play softball, he'd shut down the business all the time because he didn't feel like being there. Mr. H didn't fire him. The guy who was hired in at the end, who ended up being my replacement, he works his first week and then he misses every single day of his second week because he's in jail. Mr. H didn't fire him. The only employee he fired was the one who, go look at the introduction and see who he fired right after I gave him my 2 weeks notice. He fired the one person who was responsible, who had any interest in making this a successful place. But he was driving me absolutely crazy precisely because I was the only person who cared about this place. Mr. H hired vulnerable people mainly to service his ego. Again, he saw this as a research and development site for his own personal purposes. He didn't see it as a functioning business. That's why he didn't care about revenues or profit. So, the staff he wants there, he doesn't care how good of a job they do washing trucks. He cares about how much they service his ego. Are they going to sit still while I blah, 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 while I spend an hour or two just telling them the way the world works? Or are they going to not like that kind of thing? Can these people get away from me, or are they vulnerable, such as, are they at risk of going to jail if they don't have the job, etc., etc.? He did not hire the cream of the crop. He got me totally by mistake. If I wasn't homeless, I never would have been there asking for a job. What he had in me, he didn't use at all. All the skills and business, corporate skills that I've had in the past, the experience, I could have made this place a money-making bonanza again. But he wasn't going to allow it. He had no training, no orientation, nothing that resembles continuing education. He had nothing. He had absolutely nothing. He hired us. He was there once in a while. He didn't pay any attention really to what people were doing. He could have done so much with personnel, and that would have affected supply and demand, which ultimately affects profit. And you know what? That's about all I have on this one, and I don't know how much more I would need. You can kind of see why I started with supply and demand as far as going over business principles after the introduction here. When you really understand how that chart works and you understand the difference between someone who looks at that chart and they manage all of those things, especially in the green, but they also respond with good management to those things in the red, the external influences. When you have people who do that and companies who do that, they're doing a great job. They are managing supply and demand to meet their goals and maximize their profitability. But when you have someone like Mr. H, he completely neglects everything in that chart. Everything. Everything. And my friends, that is how not to do business. And as I've described all of this to you here, I sure hope you'll think very carefully about that and learn from his mistakes, learn from how not to do business, learn how to do business. Because if you do it differently, and if you look for all those opportunities that are there that Mr. H just blew off and ignored, you look for those in your own business, and no matter where you are right now in that business, you can turn things around, and you can start turning them around today. So I hope you'll benefit greatly from looking at this chart and the application I gave from the truck wash. Now, I may add a part 3 to this on supply and demand, because I had a bunch of what I might call commentary ideas that I'd like to add, but they are indeed my own personal ideas. I don't feel confident about them in the sense of like the scientific analysis I have in parts 1 and 2. So I don't know if I will add that or not, but don't be surprised if you see a part 3 to supply and demand, and if you do, that's what it's going to be about. It's going to be about my more esoteric ideas on this. Alright, so with that, we are done with this, and I think I know what the next episode's going to be about, but just in case, I'm not going to tell you. What I will say is please subscribe to the Homeless Consultant channel. Please like any videos that you do like. Tell other people about this. And remember that one reason I'm doing this is to get donations, encouragement, job offers, something to help me so I don't have to live in this car. And I'm telling you, friends, with the snow and with what I saw in my bank account today, I don't have much time left. And there's nobody here who's going to solve this problem. I've had 2 years to try that route, and I could really use your assistance. Beyond that, I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching.